This is African Renaissance Television Services, Arts TV. Today's edition of Horn of Africa Digest is a special panel discussion held with Anne Fitz-Gerald and Jeff Pierce. Hosted by our very own Daniel Belayneh on Fairness and Balance, international media coverage of Ethiopia.
I want to welcome you all. To my right is Professor Anne Fitz-Gerald. For those of you who know her, I don't have to say much about her, but for those of you who may not, Professor Anne Fitz-Gerald is a professor of international security and director at the Belayneh School of International Affairs in Waterloo, Canada. She obtained a PhD from Garfield University in War Studies. She published more than 30 publications on issues concerning conflict, national security, and security sector governance. She has supported the African Union, the High Implementation Panel during the referendum and peace talks between North and South Sudan, and has provided further advisory support since 2013, and is a member of the United Nations Rule of Law and Security Institutions expert roster. In November 2012, the government of Canada awarded Anne with the Queen's Diamond Jubilee Medal for her contribution to post-conflict resolution dialogue, especially in Africa. And given her knowledge and experience on peace and security, she is a person who believes that Africa, especially East Africa, has the opportunity to economically integrate and extricate itself from regional insecurity, poverty, and influence of international aid. Jeff is a Canadian author. Most of you know him. He is very active on social media fronts, especially on Twitter, regarding situations in Ethiopia. And he's a historian. He has started his career in journalism, working in radio and television station. And most importantly, he is the author of that book, which most of you might have read, Prevail, the inspiring story of Ethiopia's victory over Mussolini's invasion, 1935 to 1941. Some of the books he has written are The Karma, Booth, Gangs in Canada, and Winged Bull in June 2021. His specialties are professional editing and editorial commissioning, and he's a versatile writer, producer, a public relations expert, and media issue manager. He's also known as a passionate defender of Ethiopia's interest in the world, in many forums and in many instances. He has been a staunch defender of Ethiopia's history, and he has been fascinated by Ethiopia's long history and independence. Currently, the Western media is working against Ethiopia in a seemingly coordinated fashion, siding to one of the parties. And as a good friend, we wanted to invite Jeff to share us his reflection on this front. So now, after having introduced our guests, how we should go about on this panel is I'll ask a few questions to Anne and to both of them, or Jeff, and then after they give us their reflections on the issues raised, then I'll give the floor the chance to ask questions, whatever questions that they may have regarding the issues that they have raised. So once again, I welcome you all. I'm very happy to see so many people, and I'm sure and I'm very hopeful that we should be able to draw something very important for policymakers, especially in the international relations front that Ethiopia seems to be lagging behind. So let's start with Anne. Before that, this is the first time that you two guys met. I mean, I know that both of you are from Canada. I understand that you only met him today, right?
We've only met here in Addis Ababa.
Oh, I think he was off the mic.
Yeah.
Yes,
Okay.
we've only met.
Here in Addis Ababa, okay. I mean, this is the first time that you saw her in person.
Yeah, well, I live in Toronto. Anne lives in Waterloo. I live in the city that other Canadians refer to as the center of the universe, and we're much more of an important city than Waterloo. It's a tiny little place. You don't want to go there.
It's very scholarly in Waterloo.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, that's very good. So we have Canadians on both sides of the aisle. I'm being in the middle.
The Canadian sense of humor is kind of absurd, so.
I mean, we could get it.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's do the first question. You know, my first question goes to Jeff, you. I'd like to be clear and short.
Okay.
So how would you describe the information being consumed by the international community on the issue of Ethiopia, particularly the country's crisis on the northern part? So what's your reflection on this?
In a word, I would call it disgraceful. And I think with the audience here, I don't even need to summarize what you've seen. You've seen an international media that set out with an agenda. Their reasons for doing this are still opaque, perhaps, but if you remember, more than a year ago, it started off as Ethiopia is in chaos, Ethiopia is in chaos, it's falling apart, the sky is falling. And then after the attack in early November, it became quite clear that they had chosen one side to sympathize with and give sympathetic coverage to. And to the point where they have literally ignored Ethiopian voices. The very reason why that I'm here is because two diaspora groups funded me to come here. And months ago I was saying, when are we going to see Ethiopian voices on television represented in media? It is appalling that you can have a story in Deutsche Welle online talking about Africa for which there are no Africans even quoted in the article. They quoted Tronville, they quoted William Davidson, they quoted Michaela Wrong, not one Ethiopian, not one Eritrean quoted. And the same voices keep getting used again and again. Why is it that these people are the go-to people that they go to for commentary? Davidson, Tronville, Alex DeWall, Cameron Hudson, over and over again. Notice that they're all white guys. Now, this is a white guy saying this. But, and then we have the wonderful case of amnesia on the part of the international media, which ignores certain facts in terms of, say, the Northern attack, the Northern Command attack, which brings up the specter of supposed war crimes and then abandons that in favor of the next shiny metal object that is in their peripheral vision. Ooh, let's pursue that. So we've had ridiculous accusations with uncorroborated evidence, for everything from use of white phosphorus to, you know, it's just ridiculous. And yet at the same time, look at what happened with the New York Times. They, without meaning to, they betrayed themselves, and they betrayed those who were manipulating them by showing child soldiers in photos. And what was their line for this, which will stand in infamy in the annals of journalism? Highly motivated young recruits. Well, that's a very interesting way of putting it. So now they've shown who they are. And just as a final comment, today, well, last night, was it last night that the Telegraph piece appeared?
Yeah, it was last night.
And we have the expression used in it, the classic underdog. Okay, you know who the classic underdog is? The Ethiopian people. So the thing is, you have a terrorist group represented as the underdog, and they say, oh, they may have committed war crimes on their way towards Addis Ababa. Gee, what was my cadre? And I warned everybody, I said, you watch, you wait. The international media will eventually turn on the TPLF. They will turn on these guys because a hungry dog has no loyalty. And they will show both their colors and they will show the true colors of the TPLF. So that's a long-winded answer, but hopefully it sheds some light.
Yes. Thank you so much, Jeff. I mean, it cannot be more clear and on how you characterize the media's influence regarding especially the situation we are facing at this moment. So just to recap, I would like to tell the audience that African Renaissance Television Services is the host of this event. We organized this because of the obvious organized media campaign that's being waged by the international media, mostly the Western media, regarding Ethiopia. So the theme of the panel discussion is fairness and balance, the international media's representation of Ethiopia. So we are, even though we raise some issues here and there, it's mostly revolving around this very core topic that we are discussing today. So we are very grateful for people like Jeff and Anne, one of the very few people who actually are standing on our side, on Ethiopians' side, and defending the rights of the truth, the rights of fairness. So Anne, let me come back to you. So I want to talk to you about the U.S.-Ethiopian relations. You know, like it has been over 100 years since the United States and Ethiopia had diplomatic relations, and it has always been largely good, on and off. But this time has gone down the drain. What happened? How do you see this?
Thank you very much. It's a question that I am asked by a lot of people, actually, and I see Ethiopia as a point of confluence and conflation of a number of variables coming in. And of course, my job as an academic on this panel is to look at the data and see what we have available and to triangulate that, further research, and try to offer some propositions. And I think what we're seeing by way of the data is a new administration in the United States. And when any strategic leader comes into a new organization, usually they do a SWOT analysis of some sort, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And I think we have to remember what was a strength, what was perhaps one of the only strengths in the foreign policy agenda for the Trump administration was the Middle East peace process at the time that Biden inherited the administration. And this was a strength, and what you were supposed to do with strengths as a strategic leader is further bolster them. And so Egypt became a very important player for the Biden administration. Egypt plays a lead role in the Arab League. The Arab League is really the regional organization that is Egypt's go-to, I would say much more than the African Union. And therefore, there was a commitment there. There was an implicit commitment there, not just for the Palestinian-Israeli question, but other issues concerning the Middle East too. And what we haven't seen reported on so much in the news are the shuttle diplomacy efforts of Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed as well across the Middle East countries. And, you know, one proposition is that there was some underlying tension arising from that. But the relationship with Egypt became quite important for the US. And of course, Egypt was facing some political challenges at home. It still is. And when you're facing political challenges, as the United States is at the moment, very divided, then you have to give to your people. And usually that's in the form of economic security. And central to economic security was issues related to the GERD. And there were some projections and forecasts produced by different organizations, some of which did show a potential drop in the GDP of Egypt because of forecasts of different water levels with the fillings of the GERD. And I think this created a lot of anxiety, forged a closer partnership with Sudan, led to the US, because of its commitment to Egypt, really presentationally becoming quite committed to the Egypt-Sudan partnership. Sudan had just gone through a period of sanctions. Let's not forget why the former president in Sudan was ousted, because people really lay themselves on the line to protest because of reasons of survival. Food subsidies had been stripped. People knew the only entity to change things in Sudan would be the Sudanese armed forces. And the regime was changed. And food security became very important to Sudan, but also issues concerning military modernization, etc. So with an injection of funding, US funding into Egypt, 80 million in economic assistance, 30 million in security assistance, this became a very attractive partnership. I think as an analyst, I would say there were many short-term interests and short-term objectives, and perhaps sight was lost of the longer-term potential and the longer-term objectives by way of the massive development potential of the GERD and the potential for regional economic security between not just those three countries, but the other riparian states. I think, lastly, we saw moves of the US government in February, and indeed other places as well. I come from Canada, and we were looking very seriously at our national resilience because of the outcome of COVID-19, where we had to source PPE, where we had to source vaccines, where we had to source our food. So everybody was looking at the issue of resilience. Leading on this was the US. And Jake Sullivan called for a 100-day review on supply chain resilience because it was part and parcel of his announcement that national security and economic security would be indistinguishable moving forward. The American population was divided. He had to give a national security that catered for the American middle class. And as a result, clean, green technology, minerals, metals, resources became very important to that strategy. And along with that came the importance of the minerals and metals locked within the African continent and also the Arabian-Nubian Shield. And so this region was of strategic importance. There was a relationship between that strategic importance and the relationship between the dynamics between Egypt, Sudan, and the US. And in some respects, Ethiopia became a bit of a proxy battle space. And also the relationship with China is very important here. China has a lot of preferential trade agreements and partnerships with African countries, and it's way ahead of its measures to reach carbon-free goals by 2050. The rest of the world is way behind, including the United States, and it has to catch up. So there is really some tensions on that front as well, and I think it all culminated in the situation in Ethiopia. Tremendous pressure was put on the country, but I think at the risk of miscalculations as well, and I think one miscalculation moving forward that we'll see manifest is the strength of Africa to come together when faced with adversity. And when the chips are down, African countries do come together, and I think there's concern, especially in the aftermath of Afghanistan, about meddling, doing deals with armed groups, etc. And so I would say those three elements.
Okay. Oh, thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Anne. You know, the last statement that you said about integration is what shines in your profile. You know, like every time I say something about you or I introduce you, this is the first time we met, actually. Well, but before this, we have had some meetings on Zoom and in Google Meet. Every time, what comes to mind when somebody talks about Anne is that what she believes in the integration of, the East African region. So the last point that you raised is very important in that regard, because the United States relationship with Ethiopia always can be defined or determined with the kind of relationship and integration that we could manage to create with the Horn of Africa. In that case, by the way, I would like to inform you that African African Renaissance Television Services is launching a Horn of African Digest program, as you can see on the banner behind me. It's being planned to set up a Horn of African expertise panel, whereby every week we'll have discussions of this type on TV and on digitally, on top of those fine intellectuals. We will invite giant minds like Professor Jacob, who has been my professor, by the way, when I was in college, and I'm very happy to see him here, Professor Kassaon as well. So we would invite those people to our channels, to our discussion panels, and then the Horn of Africa and Digest is planning to become a voice of Africa in a way, specifically focusing on the Horn. So, Jeff, now, back to you. Don't worry, it's not going to be very hard. So the question that I'm asking you at this moment is, it really relates to the theme of the panel. So there have been some reports around the world, well, not some, most reports have been, which you have been investigating, so to say, and then you have been writing a lot about some of the reports being uncorroborated or lacking evidence. So what experience do you have in that? What can you share with us regarding these media reports which have never been corroborated or which have never been, which never came with evidence? So what's your finding in that regard? I think that would be the right question to you.
I think how can we approach this? You're dealing with a kind of culture of journalism in which the expression that gets used a lot is parachuting in. So for instance, as an example, someone coined the term prostitute, which I wish I had come up with that. It's brilliant. He parachuted in and covered Tigray back in March. His piece just came out in GQ. And then, of course, he went on social media and said, it would be great if the Weekend retweeted my story in a shameless self-promotion. But this fool came into the country without even bothering to research the history. We know this because he very publicly announced long after he was out of the country, that he had to go research the history of the country. So this shows you the mentality. And you can see the historical errors in his copy from the beginning. He keeps referring to the emperor as Selassie without using the full coronation name of Haile Selassie. He claims that Haile Selassie sat out the liberation of the country, which is ridiculous because Haile Selassie crossed over into Sudan with British forces in 1941. 5 minutes research would do that. He quotes, I'll mispronounce the name, Ryszard Kapuscinski, who wrote The Emperor, which is a book which is full of lies, which has been debunked thoroughly by the likes of John Ryle and others, by his own biographer. This is the type of we'll just wing it attitude that you get in terms of some international coverage. They come in, and as a brilliant photojournalist, Jamel Countess, has pointed out, which I wrote about in a Medium piece, is you have the TPLF, which is happy to provide fixers to lead them on their merry way towards the conclusions that they want these guys to find. So we get multiple, this is why it ties in with these uncorroborated evidence reports. I took a very strong position on the Axum massacre. Now I'm labeled a denier. Well, I am still waiting. Whenever we discuss this, I point out that I have video from November 30th, one of the days which Amnesty International claimed that there was blood running through the streets and that people were getting assaulted in churches. And there, during a religious event, are people walking around right outside the church. Now, please explain to me how that is possible. Why would people be doing that either a day after or a day during a widespread massacre? Then we have the AHRC report, which I won't comment on, but let's say I have questions about that. And quite frankly, while it will sound like I'm appealing to the government, I find the most convincing report so far of the Attorney General's office, which seems to line up with the facts that there was fighting in the outskirts of the city, and that makes sense to me in terms of the casualties. We can quibble over who was responsible for some of the attacks by the Eritreans, but it seems to line up with events. But the minute that I talk about this video, they get very quiet. Because how are you going to refute it? It was uploaded December 4th. Moreover, beside the fact that the accusations of the massacre happened after this, Debretzi and Geber-Michael texted to Reuters saying, "We've taken Axum." Well, he was either lying then or he's lying now. Pick one. You can't have both. So there's that. We have the accusations of white phosphorus. which, quite frankly, we haven't heard much about since, have we?
No.
And the interesting thing about that is if you look at the pattern of manipulations, the TPLF have never had an original thought in their heads. Those who are familiar with Ethiopian history know that the accusations of white phosphorus went back to the, recall, if I remember correctly, the Ethiopian-Eritrean War.
Yeah.
I wrote a letter, I don't mind sharing this, I wrote a letter to the Attorney General. I didn't get a response back, he's a very busy man. I said, look, why don't you go take soil samples? Because they're going by the victim. Now the thing is, I've known a burn victim. It is horrible. You will never forget that smell. You will never forget the agony. And I am not disputing that the person who was used as a victim in that story probably went through something horrible. That does not corroborate white phosphorus. Then we have the ridiculous occasion of the Saint Dennis Wadley, as I refer to him. As I was saying to you just before we started, I joked in a column and said, you have to get a pool skimmer to sort of hook onto the cloud to pull Dennis Wadley down. And Dennis Wadley claimed that a ship was going from, my geography might be terrible, the Caspian or Black Sea, and was making its way to Ethiopia to bring weapons. Well, that's interesting. You trust the progress of the war so well that in a landlocked country, you're going to wait for a ship to bring the weapons all the way across. It's ridiculous. Yeah. And we have this again and again and again. We had claims of Russian mercenaries. Where did they go? Again, you're dealing with goldfish memory, and you're dealing with amnesia. They move on to the very next accusation. You had the occasion of CNN, which clearly and brazenly said in a story, we got this video from Tigray Media House.
Yeah.
This is analogous to, the BBC saying, the Nazi Party gave us film footage, and we're going to use that and use their claims. How this is allowed to happen in our modern day. And it even ties into the fact of the humanitarian narrative of we've got to get the food and aid to, for instance, Mekelle, you remember months ago. I went to the Kurdish front in 2015. I stood 2 kilometers from an ISIS-held village. In all the time that I can recall the war with ISIS, there were communities held by ISIS in Iraq and Syria. Not once do I recall anyone saying, it was terrible that these communities had fallen under ISIS's sway, but not once do I recall anybody saying, oh my gosh, we have to make sure that we get aid and humanitarian help, the people are starving there. Let's cooperate with ISIS. I don't recall that, do you? And yet somehow there is an exception made for this organization. How? And when we ask these hard questions, we get marginalized and we're told that we're fringe in terms of conspiracy. We're asking sensible questions that would be asked in any other theater of war. Why is it that Africa and East Africa is treated like this? I'm still waiting for an answer.
Wow, thank you so much, Jeff. You make passionate arguments, even more passionate in saying than in writing. I thought that you were more passionate in writing.
Well, just to amplify my answer, part of my language, but it pisses me off. I mean, we're seeing such a tidal wave, such a tsunami of one-sided reportage on this. It's ridiculous. And when you look at it and say, how is it that you have all this and not once is anybody poking the holes in the Swiss cheese of these arguments? Not once do they do this. We were talking just before in terms of the Telegraph story, the classic underdog, and I mentioned it before. The Ethiopian people come together, as you said, during crisis. They came together at Adwa. They came together, patriots in the resistance in 1941. Now they're coming together again because they have this existential threat to their existence. And what do we have? Look at the portrayal of how your recent election went, where we literally have calls of, well, you should hold an election. In what other place on this planet would you have the United States and Europe say, well, you shouldn't be holding an election. You shouldn't be democratically electing your leaders. What the hell is that? Where do you see this anywhere else in the world where you say that? It goes against the very principles. Where else do you see people actually come out and defend the practice of child soldiers? And I've seen this from educated people saying, who are quoting, and they post it as, well, if a girl is 12 years old and she's old enough to be raped, she's old enough to fight. In what universe is this an either-or proposition where we put children at risk? And as somebody pointed out, I'm not going to appropriate their argument because I have no right to. I'm not a black person, but they said, interesting how this argument goes for black children, but you would never do that to European or American children. So anyway, I'll stop.
Yeah, thank you. This is a very important point that we're raising, Professor Ann. I would like to hear your take on this one.
Thank you, Danny. So again, I'm not a journalist, and I'm not a media expert.
Neither am I.
I'm an academic, so I will look at the data that exists on this and make some propositions. And the data suggests that there's 3 ways that we can characterize the media experience to date. So the first one is that there have been genuine efforts. I think we saw genuine efforts at the front end of the conflict to report on it, particularly by local media here in Ethiopia. But many of us know the vilification strategies and the attacks that people trying to report on the truth became subject to. And they were very brutal, these attacks. And they would have been felt the same way, if not more, here in Ethiopia, similar to overseas, the experience overseas. So the second category, I would say, reflected in the data is that there was some slightly out of context attempts that were using some unfortunate words, which again displays a lack of knowledge of the Ethiopian context. And those words became very misinterpreted and misunderstood by some constituencies. And I would say the third group would have been the highly lopsided accounts, skewed towards one side of the conflict that was carrying a fairly dominant narrative at the time. And I think there were reasons why those 3 categories emerged. One reason was the issue of strategic communications. We had one side of the conflict that was very, very well resourced, well prepared, well organized on strategic communications. We had another side that wasn't. And I would say that the government's approach to strategic communications at an early stage was not good. And it took a long time to develop that capacity and regular commentary that dominated the narrative in a preemptive way, not as a reactionary way. And I think the other assumption that was made perhaps on this end was that if the diplomatic community issued statements and the government itself issued statements, that would be sufficient. But it hasn't proved to be the case. So I think I won't talk about examples of evidence-based misaccountability, but I think what stands out for me is that some NGOs that have done some highly reputable work in the past have, and analysts as well, have produced accounts which people like me in the academic community have questioned on a methodological front. Methodology should be rigorous, reproducible, recordable, and we're up against the speed of and the amplification of social media these days as well. And that puts a layer on the projection of analysis, and people are racing to get it out. And that approach to racing to get out analysis leaves behind peer review. And peer review is very important to have that checks and balance system to make sure that research is triangulated, that balanced perspectives are put into play. And we didn't see a lot of the peer review going on. Let's not forget that policy on internet governance is lagging behind the realities of internet governance. So I think the message is it's incumbent on countries like Ethiopia, which have been let down by misinformation and disinformation, to become more robust about the knowledge they consume, to bolster the capacity of their own media outlets here in Ethiopia and in the region, and perhaps to develop tools in civil society to evaluate the knowledge and information that's being consumed.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And that was so elaborate and very interesting to listen to that analysis. I mean, I understand you're not a journalist, so that's from the intellectual perspective. As an academician, you put it very well, and it just sparks something in me, especially with what you said about amplification of social media. And in my opinion, I think we are losing the diplomatic fight, mostly because we are not as effective as the other side, whichever that may be, on the social media side. Sometimes it amazes me that the same story, the same footage, the same narrative, on the different channels, they could have probably a difference of 200,000 different viewership, a difference of 200,000 in viewership. It's all about being smart on that regard. And I remember, and we talked last time, I don't know if I said this to you, but there is no, somebody said there is no fake news, but there is only digital illiteracy. So many people, including myself perhaps, are suffering from the digital illiteracy that we are pushing ourselves into the losing ground. So we are planning to exercise an increased amplification of the social media fight. Well, I mean, not necessarily social media, but any digital media for that matter. So Jeff, with that regard, I heard that, well, you told me, and I heard that you've been up in the north. You just came back a day before yesterday. You've seen quite lots of stories, and I just want to hear what happened. Could you tell us?
Can I speak just one comment to your previous point, though?
Yes, sir.
One of the things which gets lost in the shuffle, which people don't appreciate, is that we're hearing more talk about PSYOPs. Anne Fitz-Gerald has done brilliant work on this, and it sort of triggered something in me, because the thing is, PSYOPs, if you don't know, was actually invented in Ethiopia, and it was invented to actually help you. A gentleman called George Steer, who wrote about the invasion of Ethiopia sympathetically, went back to Ethiopia with the British forces and was in charge of the propaganda unit. I will apologize because my pronunciation of Ethiopian names and places is atrocious. But y'all recall Lorenzo Tazaz, who wrote the famous speech.
You said it very well, man.
Yeah, that's about the only one I can Lorenzo Tazaz and George Steer developed PSYOP techniques. When you saw the US blasting loudspeakers in Afghanistan or Iraq, when they would do this against even Noriega in Panama, that was developed by George Steer. What they did was they would get out a music speakers and they would play Italian songs to break the morale of the fascist soldiers. They were the ones that came up with the idea of getting people who were deserters to tell their stories of what it was like to be in the fascist ranks and explain to their own comrades to say, look, you really don't want to stay in this fight. All these PSYOP techniques were developed in Ethiopia originally to help liberate the country. So when it comes to social media, we have to re-educate ourselves in terms of what's being effective. And what Anne said, I want to pick up on that point because I believe it too. The fact of the matter is the Ethiopian government and the Ethiopian people went in with a sincere belief that they would be believed. That of course the truth, if it became manifest, would be obvious and that people would go, well, yeah, of course. And lo and behold, you have a sophisticated manipulative system which is geared towards getting the fixers to lead these guys down the garden path, which is geared towards setting the agenda and constantly putting outrages out there. And so myself, just to sort of give you an example, you look at Alula Solomon of the Tigray Media House. Now the thing is, you can fight this guy one-on-one and go head-to-head and debunk all of the ridiculous claims and inflammatory claims that he comes out with each day. And finally I decided, well, that's going to get lost in the sea of trouble. I'm not a journalist. I don't call myself a journalist per se anymore. I call myself a writer. So I have the license to do things. So I went, okay, if you're going to make stupid, ridiculous claims, I'm going to treat you like a stupid, ridiculous person. And I have no problem. I will not apologize for that. I believe more of that should be done to make these people look ridiculous and to take away their power. So we have to relearn the tools in terms of how to fight back all over again. It can't just be with the truth, but also with, in terms of who's telling the story, where we're telling the story, and Anne mentioned local reporters. Local reporters, Ethiopian reporters, have to be enfranchised. They have to be given access. I'm not that smart a guy. I went back to, when we got back from my cadre, which I'll get to in a moment, I said to someone casually, my God, they were using priests to fundraise to get the weapons. And the person who was next to me said, yeah, we know that. It was reported on our media. Well, why is this not getting out to the Western world? So we've got to find ways to get your reportage at the forefront and also communicate it, but also get those Ethiopian reporters access to the areas because they're doing a brilliant job. Now, when it comes to my cadre, what I saw, excuse me, life goes on because it has to. And if one of these guys from these big brands went out there, they would sensationalize it and make it terrible, and it is terrible. What's missing is the nuance in terms of what really happened, and they are trying to portray it as both sidisms. We went there, and the credit really goes to two of your own, Nitsanet Laku and Genet Ayele, who really spoke to the victims. And I wanted them to speak to the victims and me sort of be in the background, because bald white guy asking questions, complete stranger, comes to your country, asks you questions about the worst day of your life, where you lost your kid or lost your husband. Great, that's going to work. So these two individuals did a wonderful job of connecting with the victims, getting them to open up and tell their stories. And yeah, it's as horrific as you can expect. We have a woman who describes how her husband is hiding on the roof. They went for her child. He jumps down and is murdered in front of her. By the time we were done, the university researcher who helped set it up so we could talk to the victims, he was, not to embarrass the gentleman, but he was in tears all over again. And he's heard these stories before. Genet was visibly upset. Other people were visibly upset. How could you not be hearing these stories? And we have, if you see the video, which I've uploaded, we have a pan of all the victims that we brought to talk to, going down the long list, including showing their injuries. And you look at this and you go, why are the rest of you not here? Why are you not telling their stories? I'm standing in a graveyard where there's a bulldozer that they left behind to move the bodies, and they're telling me how 50 to 60 people are piled in one area with 300 more. There's 1,564 victims, and the researchers tell me the count is still going to go up. Where is the Western media? Reuters just did a story recently where they said, well, both sides are responsible for this. Okay, fine. Go back and talk to these people, because they know the names of the people who attacked them. Go back and do your actual homework. It just makes me so angry. And that was my cadre.
Yeah.
And reported properly by your own reporters. So.
Yeah, thanks so much, Jeff. That was a moving story. And well, personally, I share your frustration in that regard. But that's one of the purposes of setting up this kind of gatherings, so that we have a united front against such barbarism, against such coordinated blemish and disinformation to the outright lie about how things are going up north or down south. So, Anne, let me come to you on this one. The federal government, the Ethiopian federal government, has declared a unilateral ceasefire, which some people described it was because he was forced to, because he was on a losing ground on the battle. And others say that the outlawed group was gaining some momentum, so that the government could not actually resist or defend, so literally they ran away. There are different schools of thought in that regard, so we just wanted to see from the academic perspective, from what you've been studying about this, what is your take? What happened there? What was it?
Well, I wasn't there either, so I should put that on the table right away. But as a researcher, you try to bring views from as many groups as possible. Look, I think it's important to recognize what an insurgency is here, because there's a big difference between conventional war and insurgency. Insurgency is a war amongst the people. The people, whether they like it or not, become part of the war. And it's a fight between two sides as to who wins over the people. So insurgencies, classic insurgency doctrine dictates that there are three components. One is the guerrilla fighters at the front end. A second is the what's called the auxiliary, and they're the communicators that work in the communities, sharing the narrative, trying to influence thinking. And then you have what's been called historically the underground. And of course the underground until now never worked on the internet, but now they do work on the internet. So I want to set that context just to highlight what the federal forces were facing. Some have argued that the conventional war was over fairly quickly, but the insurgency became protracted, and this was forecasted by a number of analysts. And so the federal forces were faced with a huge risk of civilian casualties if they continued the insurgency fight. And that was a risk with the scrutiny on the federal government that the government could ill afford, particularly as it involved children, women, deeply connected to those strategic policy agenda of the international community. Sexual and gender-based violence, women empowerment and marginalized group empowerment, the rights and protection of children. And this was highly organized and highly orchestrated towards those ends. The other thing was that the federal government was coming under pressure, intense pressure by the international community, particularly the US, to draw back. And so it did, and it did so under the auspices of a unilateral ceasefire agreement. That means one party signs up to terms and conditions that become binding on them. There's always a hope that the other side enters into some sort of moral equivalency on those binding agreements, but that hasn't happened. So the outcome, which you asked in the question, Daniel, I guess the biggest outcome is that there was a lack of thinking on who would be the local authority for the international community to work with to deliver humanitarian aid. I think there was an assumption that let's give it a try and work with the remaining government elements and development aid elements in Tigray. But with a massive effort on the fighting, it left no local authority really to work with. And I think that probably could have been better forecasted. I think the second thing was that without any federal authorities in the region, and I say this in defense of the aid agencies and the humanitarian organizations, they were living in circumstances of heightened fear and insecurity. The third thing was that the humanitarian disaster expanded. It expanded in Tigray. It was fairly contained up until that point, but it expanded not only across Tigray, but into Afar and Amara, neighboring regions. And that was because of another outcome, and in keeping with classic insurgency tactics, which call for deflection to other border areas to confuse the opponents. But the atrocities that continued to be learned of, such as the killing of Tigrayan refugees, reprisal killings, such as the killing of local administrators who had cooperated with the interim government administration, could not be blamed on the federal authorities because they were not in Tigray. So that almost led to an incentive to regionalize the fighting so others could be blamed for those atrocities. And that's what we've seen. That's what we've seen play out. So the outcome, I would say, is that it left a situation where, with the government having made concessions, without any concessions being reciprocated by the TPLF junta, without any pressure from the international community to condemn many of these crimes and crimes against humanity, ongoing fighting, border incursions. To the United States' credit, we did see Samantha Powell, USAID administrator, appeal to the TPLF junta to withdraw from the regions. But not only was that appeal ignored, it was blatantly violated. And since then, we have seen no pressure to withdraw, to cease fire on the TPLF. And that overall outcome, and I'll finish with this, means that there's no hope for a political solution or a political outcome. It leaves a military solution in sight only. And I think that's what we're seeing on the ground now.
Okay. Thanks, Dan. We will be having a question and answer session with the audience as well. So I haven't actually told, the program rundown is on the invitation cards, but just to recap, we'll be having a couple of questions to each of our panelists, and then I'll leave the floor for any questions that you may have to either of them. That's how we should go. So I have left, well, you can think about questions that you would like to ask in the meantime, because I have been able to prepare these questions because I have had time. I knew that I would be moderating this event, so I have been preparing these questions. It was easier for me. So I would give you the chance for that to the audience. And now, Jeff, let me get back to you once more. So it's about the media ethics and principle. I just wanted to ask you, because you said you consider yourself as a writer than probably a journalist, but most of us see you as a warrior, honestly. Yeah, I would say that, because I read most of what you write, including the books. So,
did you say warrior?
Yeah, warrior, like not in terms of sphere and shield.
God help you then. Half-blind, middle-aged, bald guy who's shaped like a pear. Yeah.
It all depends on the front, you know. Which front are you fighting on? Yeah. The fight is digital, and you are doing an absolutely perfect job in that. Yeah, I could say that. So, regarding ethics and principle in the international media, especially referring to Ethiopia, like, what's your assessment?
Well, let's circle back to two brilliant points that Anne just made. Hopefully I'm encapsulating them properly. I mean, the thing is, yeah, you're seeing a terrorist group forced to govern and then failing, obviously, on the face, if I got that correctly. And you also have them deflecting in terms of spreading out to other regions so they can spread blame. And we're seeing no condemnation of that at all in terms of the international community. Do I have that correct? Okay, so the thing is, where's the media ethics in terms of reporting that?
Yes.
Why aren't they noticing this? Moreover, the thing is, we haven't seen ethics from the very beginning. And I can rattle off countless examples. Part of the problem is the culture of foreign correspondence, which are parachuted in. Now, with the certain exceptions, like two come to mind, Zacharias, Samuel Getachew, there are Ethiopian reporters, but look at how it's being interpreted. White guys, mostly white guys, and some white women come to a foreign African country and are going to interpret it for you. And I had an argument in DMs on Twitter with a correspondent who shall go, economist, nameless, and this guy said to me, don't you think it's kind of, you shouldn't be talking about, it's a very volatile situation in Ethiopia, and you shouldn't be like criticizing the media. And I replied to him, are you kidding me with this? Do you honestly think that East Africans cannot go online and see what you write and make their own assessment? You think that it's the 1930s where only people in London are picking up a newspaper with your report. So automatically, their reportage is not for you. Their reportage is for people who look like me and Ann on the other side of the world, and they're not accountable to you. They don't answer to you. So, and I haven't solved the equation of how we repair that, but what I do know is there's a big, huge problem with that. You can rattle off how many of these white correspondents are interpreting Africa for you. Declan Walsh, Will Brown, Tom Gardner, who else have I? We could go on and on. Anna Cara, all of them are white. All of them are white. Look at in terms of how they report, in terms of the ethics of taking material directly from the mouthpiece of a terrorist organization, Tigray Media House. Look at how they're using what they call open source investigative tools in terms of satellite imagery. So in other words, you don't have to go there. You don't even have to show up. You'll just interpret this from blurry pictures. And we've seen how that worked out. We could go on, and so I came to the conclusion, and I wasn't completely comfortable with this, but I came to the conclusion of, look, you were a guest in the country. I'm a guest in this country. If you're going to screw around and lie about it, yeah, you deserve to get your ass kicked out. I have no problem with that in terms of giving, Simon Marks the bum's rush out of the country. I have no problem with William Davison getting put on a plane and taken over because I consider him a threat to national security. Here's a guy who supposedly is an analyst who's running a side business of a media outlet where he pretends to be an editor, and his articles are seemingly deliberate to incite and inflame ethnic tensions and political tensions within the country. Get the hell out of here. Unfortunately, this has created an atmosphere in which, frankly, is affecting the access and the reaction towards your own local Ethiopian reporters. And these guys, by and large, are doing a good job. A lot of the material which I'm learning about secondhand from people telling, well, this was on Ethiopian media. We need to empower these people to get access to the areas, to be able to report the story and get them into those areas. People like the people that I've worked with. And they're, just to give you an example, is literally black and white, no pun intended. We're talking to the researchers at the University of Gondar. I'm not fluent in Amharic, but I checked later. And there is Natsanet Laku and there is Genet Ayala saying, wait, how do you know this? What's your proof of this? How do we know this for sure? That's journalism. That's what you do. You don't just take the word of the fixer who leads you to these people. You check. You check your facts. You check and hold the people accountable for what they're telling you. And we're not seeing that. So, quite frankly, I would love to see, and I've put this idea in print, I believe, I would love to see a major conference held, whether it be in Addis Ababa or somewhere else in Africa, in terms of looking at the whole problem of how journalism is, international journalism is covering Africa. and invite some of the most people, much smarter and better than me, to be on platforms like this and be saying, okay, what can we do to repair this? How can we fix this so that we're telling our own stories? It is an irony that I am up here busy pontificating when I shouldn't be here at all. And the only reason why I'm here is because they're not listening to you. They sent me here because they're saying they won't listen to us. And the reason why they go after me is because I'm a threat to them, in terms of saying, because I know how the sausages are made. And I say, no you don't. Well, we need to move the next step so that I'm superfluous, so that I'm unnecessary, so that you guys can go, oh, no, you don't. Here is how we report the story. You live up to our standards.
Oh, thank you so much, Jeff. I like the idea of suggesting for a big international conference in Africa or possibly in Addis Ababa or where else.
Please invite me when you do.
That's a very good idea. I honestly think that's one of the things that we should be considering as a result of these proceedings. And so let me get back to you once more. Hopefully it would be, okay, one of the last two questions, but I have to give the audience some time to ask you some questions as well. So it's a very important question, this one. A bit serious, I guess. Well, I mean, the rest were serious too, but this is more about speculation or prediction, I would say. So there are various scenarios some people are saying about how this thing would unfold, will keep unfolding, the situation in the north, militarily, diplomatically, or some other way. What are the possible scenarios? What do you think are the possible scenarios? You are the right person to give us the closest and the most accurate prediction, I would think. So from the intellectual point of view, what do you think are possible scenarios coming out of this quagmire that we are finding ourselves in? Clear?
Well, if I had a crystal ball. But again, looking at what the data is suggesting and what we are seeing, much of which is not verified and authenticated yet, but I think there are probably possibilities for two potential scenarios. I think if a military campaign plays out and it results in some sort of surrender on the part of the TPLF junta, and we are hearing, whether they're true or not, about some divisions and splits because of the way that this latest phase of the campaign in Tigray has left many more people begging for food because of a registration system that has been introduced that only offers food to those who contribute fighters, those families who contribute fighters. Jeez. So, you know, we're seeing food aid being used as a weapon of war, certainly now. And if this moves, if there is defeat on the part of the TPF junta and we see some form of surrender, then I would say, because of the democratic pathway that the people of Ethiopia have voted for and fiercely defended, rule of law and accountability become very important at the highest level of crimes, the highest level of treason. However, that will have to be paralleled by a magnanimous approach taken by government at other levels. I think it would have to be paralleled by an atmosphere of forgiveness and reconciliation and healing. You know, especially in insurgencies, perfectly decent people who are not predisposed to violence find themselves caught up in circumstances that come under duress for many, and circumstances that come with a different narrative and therefore which promote a feeling of necessity for people to do what they do. And that's why I'm underscoring the importance of reconciliation, healing, forgiveness. The other scenario is that there is not such a clear military outcome, and that both sides potentially weaken and people come together in some form of talks. Now, I think based on what we're hearing from the federal government side, talks are unlikely to take place with the strategic leadership command and control element of the TPLF junta, but perhaps there's a more moderate group of voices that talks could take place with. And so, regardless of those two outcomes, there will be a primary objective to cater for the people, to support the humanitarian effort, to make sure the distribution of humanitarian aid is full, comprehensive, that help and support is given to rebuild the infrastructure. An infrastructure, I would say, that millions of birr has been put into rebuilding a number of times to be destroyed again. Mm-hmm. And after that humanitarian effort, and in parallel to some extent, healing support, reconciliation support, programs to support alternative livelihoods, especially for those who found themselves at the front line, for those families that were deeply deprived and communities that were deeply affected by the fighting, and a massive national effort to help that. I think a multi-party coalition interim government framework is a possibility as well, would be strongly recommended, I think, on my part, just to develop a culture and socialize awareness of multi-party politics and the people's role in politics. Before, I think, according to the vanguard politics culture in Tigray, there was an assumption that the people had to work for the party. And of course, in democratic politics, the party must work for the people. So the people's voices must be heard. And I think what we're not hearing in the media as well is a lot of work that has been done already on the national dialogue process, the work by MIND, the multi-stakeholder initiative for national dialogue, because pre-dialogue talks have already taken place. They have, sadly, because of the conflict, excluded communities in Tigray, but that system and framework is in place and ready to become completely inclusive. And support of the international community really has to come behind this. And so I would say, lastly, and beyond the inclusive dialogue, an election in the region. So humanitarian effort, prioritization given to the people, multi-party coalition, interim arrangement, dialogue, and an election. And then Parliament, the right body that should be having discussions about constitutional reform, can learn from the dialogue. Security sector reform and changing the way in which the regional security structures are configured and have a direct line of loyalty to the regional presidents as opposed to the center, that can be changed. We can hopefully do something about the Leo-Heil special police forces that operates as a paramilitary at the regional level. That needs to come under some framework that rests with the Ethiopian Defense Forces and not a police. The police that has been the poor relative across the regions in all of this, this framework and this governance structure needs to be given the knowledge and the tools and skill sets it needs to cater for the people. You know, the security institutions are institutions for the people. So a people's military, a people's police, and hopefully there will be opportunities for those who may have been deeply affected and involved in the fighting to transition to alternative livelihoods.
Well, thank you so much. And those were interesting scenarios, some of them scary, some of them hope-inciting. But Jeff, so as a journalist or maybe as an author, especially from the fact that you've been traveling the last 2 weeks. From what you've seen there, from on the ground, do you agree with these scenarios, or you have a different take?
Well, as you can probably see, Anne is the rationalist, and I look at the material and I obviously have more emotional reactions. And the thing is, I am not going to presume to disagree with Anne because she's researched this delicately. And plus, I can be wrong. I don't like it when, I don't include myself as a journalist anymore, but I don't like it when journalists speculate because they're usually doing it off the cuff, and I can be wrong. I look at things from a more instinctive gut level. Part of the reason why I came here was because, as you can tell from, if you've looked at my work, I'm hawkish about this war, but how can I write about this without seeing it? I would love to go to the front. I know there are many fronts, but I want to go see it. How can I encourage this without going there and seeing what's being done and being right there and putting myself to some, hopefully to some degree of some limited risk? I'll take it. I don't care. I want to go see it. Anne mentioned forgiveness. This is interesting because I go back to the history, and this is something which I think is part of the Ethiopian character. You look at the Battle of Adwa. Adwa is celebrated every year, but what I always find interesting is if you've read Raymond Jonas's excellent book on the Battle of Adwa, and you read other accounts, what's interesting is how Menelik led the prisoners of war, the Italian soldiers, back, and they were well treated to the point where Empress Taitu would be coming each day, and the Italians would go, "The bread lady, the bread lady," and they were well treated. Soldiers were brought terrified in front of the emperor, and Menelik put them at ease and treated them this way. In 1941, when this country was liberated by the Patriots, notice, and I'm going to say Patriots first, and the British forces, Emperor Haile Selassie said, "Do not return evil for evil. Let them walk," basically I'm paraphrasing here because I can't remember the whole speech, but let them walk out of this country because we want them as friends again. Let them go, and that's done, that's over with. So don't do reprisals. It's in the nature of your character for this kind of forgiveness. Now granted, this is a war in which what seems to be forgotten by these Western media types is Tigrayans are Ethiopians. And this is a bitter contest. But look at, say, how Nima Elbiger of CNN in that infamous piece talks about Amharization. Good God. They don't have a clue. They just don't have a clue. And they are stoking and pitting ethnic peoples against each other. My own reading of history, and I think I can back this up, is that from centuries past, all of your ethnic peoples collaborated and cooperated to create the Ethiopia that you have. This does not mean that ruling elite did not work together to get what they want or to conquer. But you look at Susanios leading an Oromo army. You look at Menelik relying on Gobina in terms of getting the subjugation of certain communities. You have the various peoples working together. Haile Selassie had a Oromo ancestry, yet they refer to him in the Western media as Amhara elite. It's ridiculous. They don't have a clue, they don't read. And they are treating it as you guys are on the brink of being a failed state. That's not what I see, that's not what I see out in the field. Every day, you guys are my teachers, and I learn something new about you. And I don't pretend to be an expert on Ethiopian history or Ethiopian affairs at all. I came to see, and you teach me. And so I write what you tell me and what you teach me, and I try to communicate forth. And I cannot believe that this is how that things are going to fall apart. I believe that you will eventually prevail. And you will come to your own solution. I'm not going to advocate a solution because it's not for me to say, that's for your answer. I can't predict the scenarios. I just know that you folks will find a way to fix this yourselves. And there's a reason why the hashtag is Ethiopia Prevails. Because you always do. You always will. The thing is, two quotes keep going in my head over and over again from Orwell. One is that He says in 2 different essays, he says, you know, we always believe that good will triumph over evil, but there's nothing there's nothing rational to say that it's going to, that it's a foregone outcome. We just hope that it's going to be that way. But what else do we have? And the second thing is that it's presented as war is, as if it's a good versus evil rather than evil versus evil. You have a choice. Of course war is terrible. But consider the enemy that you're fighting. What other choice do you have? You know, we have the weaponization of aid. We have child soldiers being used. You have to prevail, because in prevailing, you show that these sort of things cannot be done again on this continent, elsewhere. You're fighting for something even higher than your own sovereignty. You're fighting for humanitarian values to prevail. So I can't give you a scenario. I have hope, and I'll just work with that. And I think that's rewarded by what I see out in the field.
No, thank you very much, Jeff. That was very interesting. So I'm just keeping time exactly as we agreed. So, Anne, this is a very important question, I guess. I mean, all of the questions were very important, but since you have lots of works, I know, but some of your works, which we've been able to read, focus and analyze the origin of this crisis and how it culminated and it reached this level. So as a country, I mean, we are looking forward. We have to look forward. So if we were to reflect on these issues for the future, what do you think we should learn? What do you think we should derive from this complete, sorry to use the word, but nonsense?
Thank you. It's great to look forward. And I think we all need to have that attitude. So that's the first thing that we need to learn. We need to learn to look forward. I think the first thing that we need to take away from this and respect is the duty of a head of state when something like a terrorist attack happens in a country. Any NATO country in the West would see it as a dereliction of duty of the head of state for him or her not to respond quickly to restore the legitimacy of the state and use all national instruments to be deployed to do so. I think the second thing that we need to learn about moving forward is the importance of political reconciliation. It was a very unique situation here in Ethiopia in terms of the governance culture, the interfederal dynamics, and other exigencies related to the context of this wondrous, ancient, and very populous, diverse country. But what we are seeing elsewhere in the world is the sustainment of regimes and administrations for a very, very long period of time, out with constitutional limits. And when the change does eventually come, that we're going to be seeing more and more of, we're seeing it in other African countries now, there's that reality of age and attrition. So we have to see it in some circumstances. We see in Myanmar, where Aung San Suu Kyi, applauded by the international community, given a Nobel Peace Prize, really left us in hope that something would be brought to that country, completely powerless up against the dominant position of the Tamada, the military in Myanmar, in parliament. So she hasn't been able to preside as a head of state. And I think when we as an international community support change, we can't run away when change gets messy. We need to have new tools to help support change too. And I think one thing where an investment is required is political reconciliation. Or else, if you're trying to move on as a country with the victors and the vanquished, there will be inevitable problems. And I think not only does an investment need to be taken forward in this area, but the trends afterwards need to be monitored. And people need to stay on top of this, reevaluate the direction it's going in often, and really invest policies and resources into managing that process, even if it means stripping other areas in the short term of resources. The other thing we've learned, and we've all talked about this today, is the importance of evidence-based analysis, especially in the age of the internet, giving the people through civil society engagement tools that they can use to be more judicious about the knowledge they consume. Also encouraging countries and higher education institutions to fully stand behind academic freedom of expression and freedom of expression more widely. With digitalization, it brings a lot of benefits, but we live with digital intimidation as well. And I can say from firsthand experience, I'm very relieved that I live in a country like Canada, where human rights and freedoms are prioritized and defended, and that includes academic freedom of expression, because digital intimidation throughout the last 9 months has been intense. I think another thing that we have learned is the importance of strategic communications. And in this era of the internet, that authorities and leading organizations have to be very clear about their activities, their mandates, the outcomes and impacts of their work. Yes, we'll always have things that we can't discuss openly because of reasons of national security. But even if you talk to the Five Eyes countries these days about intelligence, 90% of the intelligence they collect is available on open source. So in response, I think strategic communications needs to be more open without gray area. And I think we saw some gray area with the whole issue of Eritrea's involvement in the conflict. That raises questions, and you want to try to limit any development of gray area, to have clarity, transparency, and importantly, trust. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. Thanks so much, Professor Anne. So, Jeff, any last words? Because I have to give the audience the chance to ask you. I'm sure they have so many questions. So I'll give you a chance to wrap up whatever you have in mind, based on what Anne just said, or on the overall theme of the event.
The intimidation, the digital intimidation, is very real. We've seen academics getting attacked. We've seen those who are the voices who are backing the Ethiopian position get intimidated and smeared. I, for one, am one of those. We've seen others get attacked. It's a very sophisticated apparatus brought to bear, and the pressure is unbelievable. And of course, you have to go, okay, how do I respond to ridiculous claims which are just come out of thin air? And you see this as well towards academics, to the point where I believe, when was it? There was a whole list of academics who wrote a paper saying, enough is enough, knock it off. Like, we're going to say what we want, we're going to use evidence-based research. We stand together in terms of academic freedom and so forth. And the same has to happen in terms of the media community, for which I've only seen one reporter, for instance, echo some of the questions and work that I've done in terms of the Axum massacre, and that was an Italian reporter for a publication, I think, out of Rome. It's the point where the media consolidation, the big brands have such a huge shadow over coverage that you have to punch at the darkness to just to bleed daylight, to quote the lyrics, and that's what we're up against, just a monolithic machine, and the enemy knows very well how to use it, how to manipulate it, how to make it work for them, and when that doesn't do it, they will threaten. They will literally threaten people physically. Over direct messages in social media. They'll say, come meet me at a corner of such and such. Let's talk. And we'll see about that. And they've done this to several people. Or they smear. We have to ignore all that noise, though, and go, nope, we're going to keep pushing for the evidence-based research. We're going to keep pushing to get these voices which are not heard in public and out there. I think you are starting to see the tide turn, not through any impulse of conscience on the media's part. I've researched gangs in my own country. A lot of what we see reminds me of gang dynamics. I made a prediction ages ago, it'll be interesting to see where this bears out, where there are certain immigrant communities, of course, as they move to, say, North American and European communities and assimilate, they can often go through a stage where a certain portion of them become you have gang-related activities. We have this in Canada. Well, you already have an organization which I would compare to a Russian oligarchy and acts like a Russian oligarchy terrorist group. You're going to see those evolve into more brazen gang elements, probably in North American, European communities.
Danny,
I could be wrong.
Can I say one more thing about that? Because I think it's always good to, if this is the last question, to finish on a positive note. And I think one thing that we've seen very positive as a result of this tragic experience is the capacity, particularly here in Ethiopia and Ethiopians across the world, but also with us and anybody else, friends of Ethiopia and those with an interest in writing on Ethiopia, is the capacity to be critical about analysis, the capacity to look at what's written with real scrutiny these days. And this has really been a litmus test for that in many ways. And it's fantastic seeing Ethiopian analysts and Horn of Africa scholars take such a judicious approach to asking questions now, being what I would call not just critical, but intellectually disobedient and not just fitting to the mold. So I just wanted to finish on a good note.
I wish I could have said something positive.
Well, I mean...
Yeah, I kind of put it on a downer note, didn't I?
It's actually more interesting. I mean, don't worry about it. I mean, I guess you were blatant.
The rationalist is the positive person. Well, the emotionalist is the negative.
That's why I'm sitting in the middle, just to balance it.
Yeah,
in a way. Thank you very much. Still, you'll have lots of questions, I'm sure, from the audience. So I will leave the floor open. I take 3 questions at a time, right? That would be okay, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and they can direct it to either of them or both of them.